Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Today, I'm delighted to be talking with Brian Albrecht. Brian is the Chief Economist at the International Center for Law and Economics. His research is on the interplay of competition and information within economic theory. He also writes at the popular Substack, Economic Forces. Welcome, Brian.
Happy to be here.
So before we start, can you tell us a little bit about your career and how did you become an economist?
Yeah, so I discovered economics in my undergrad. I wasn't an economics major. I was actually a physics and political science major, but started reading blogs at the time. This was after 2008, financial crisis, started reading blogs at the time, really got interested in economics, popular books on economics, so the discussion that was going on, and decided to go to grad school and kind of devote my life to the study of economics.
Where did you go to grad school?
Since I did not have a real training in economics, I decided to do a master's in Barcelona, which is, I tell my students, there are worse spots to spend your early 20s than living in Barcelona. And then I did my PhD at the University of Minnesota. And there, I really got attracted to the work on economic theory. My advisor, David Rahman, really got me excited about economic theory. And so I spent those 6 years really going kind of pure theory route, formal models, really in the math type of stuff like that. Then I went and became a professor down in Kennesaw State for a little while. Got more interested in the policy angle, especially antitrust, which is kind of where I work now, theory and antitrust. But for the last 2 years, I've been at the International Center for Law and Economics, as you said. So I get time to do my own research. I get time to write on all sorts of policy angles, especially around antitrust, mergers, non-competes, things like that. And also do a lot of public-facing economics. So as you said, I have a newsletter. I've always liked blogs. Circle it back. I got really into blogs. I'm active on Twitter, and I really like that aspect of economics discourse, economics education. So that's something that I'm encouraged to do now, and I continue to do kind of each and every day.
Yeah, and I'll say, I mean, your Substack is really kind of one that I think all students should be reading. You guys, so you're co-author, is that a co-author or co-substacker? I don't know. How do you say? Josh Hendrickson? Is it?
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are very different angle. He's a monetarist, but it is just really good but accessible economic thinking. And so I know that my daughters subscribe now, and it's just like I really recommend it. And I discovered you because of Twitter. So each time, like when people complain about Twitter, I'm always like, yeah, I get it. But there's actually a very healthy way to use Twitter. So let's start. So a few weeks ago, I talked with Ryan Bourne, who has this new book that he edited called The War on Prices. And you have a really great and important chapter in the book looking at some of the myths surrounding the reason behind inflation. And it's basically this idea that inflation has nothing to do with the monetary side or the fiscal side or both or whatever. It's all about greed, corporate concentration, and all that good stuff. So first, let me ask you this question. Is this idea that inflation is a product of greed, is this a new idea, or is this something that, like, was it a source of the conversation 40 years ago, last time we had a ton of inflation? Was it a source of conversation after the little inflation, the teeny bit of inflation we had, like after the Great Recession? It wasn't much, but
yeah, it's a good question, and I mean, some sense, yes. Greed, blaming corporations is always part of a conversation for any kind of bad time, unemployment, recessions, things like that. I don't have a real good example from, say, the 70s inflation about talking about greed. There were people writing about the greed of unions, actually, surprisingly, as a cause of inflation, which kind of ties with this idea that wages are what cause inflation.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely the idea of the cause of inflation being just firms decide to charge higher prices. And that's kind of the core of where we should put our focus, being what is causing inflation. That's definitely been around for a long time, and related to ideas of, why, if that's true, then maybe price controls could be a reasonable response. But as I try to argue in the piece and a bunch of stuff I've written over the last almost 3 years now, I don't think that that's a helpful way to think about inflation. I think it'll lead to bad policy outcomes.
Okay, so union being greedy, come on, that's nonsense. Or them creating inflation is nonsense. But corporations, Brian, we know they're greedy. Aren't they behind this inflation?
Yeah, there's a as someone who grew up in learning economics on blogs and YouTube and stuff, there's a great Milton Friedman on the Donahue show. It's always the other guy who's greedy. So it's a question of, this term gets thrown out, greedflation, greed being the cause of inflation. It's really a catch-all. I mean, I don't think anyone, if you're going to push them and say, did corporations all of a sudden become greedy? If they actually, if you push that question to them, no one's going to say yes. So in some sense, it's a straw man, but people keep latching onto it as kind of a general framework for thinking about, like, okay, what's really changed is now the corporations found some new pricing power, found some new ability. And there could be different reasons for that, but that, like, the focus should be on these pricing decisions that the firms are doing. That is really what changed in 2022.
So the idea is, okay, so there's inflation, there's prices are rising, corporations are always looking to make more profit. This is a good way to hide this need for profits and to basically hide it along the way with real inflation? Or is it a causal thing?
This is a great question. It really is what gets me frustrated about the discourse. And one of the parts I lay out in the paper is I think we should always be trying to come up with a causal theory of inflation. This thing changed, therefore we got inflation. Or this thing changed, therefore that caused something else, which caused inflation. In the same way that I've used a quote from Tom Sowell, who got from Larry White, who got from yada, 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 all the way back about, plane crashes aren't caused by gravity.
Yeah.
Yes, if we could shut off gravity, we wouldn't have plane crashes of the same type, but that's not really what we think of as the cause of things. And so greed is always there. You could imagine over a long stretch there being some meaningful way in which greed would change, that the way that people in the US today think about money and greed is different than people 500 years ago thought about it. But over any year, 2-year period, obviously that's not what has changed. So the question is, okay, firms haven't gotten more greedy. If pushed on it, no one's going to say that they have gotten more greedy. Okay, so then what else could it be? What else about their pricing power could it be? And some people have a little bit more sophisticated stories about, well, this just allowed them to kind of get away with it. They always wanted to do this. But then now there's the war in Ukraine, there's COVID readjustments and realignments in the economy. Okay, this gave them a cover, and now they have an excuseflation. They have an excuse for why they can raise prices. Again, that to me always is just kind of kicking the can down the road, begging the question. You want to know, okay, why now can they?
Yeah, and there's always this partial equilibrium as opposed to general equilibrium mentality going on, which is that companies can do whatever they want and consumers are not reacting at all. So I find always this just incredibly frustrating. It's like pretty much this is a thing that is just driving me like insane pretty much in everything policy. So
can I say a little bit more on that? Because I think they're actually
sure, absolutely, please do.
It's been a thing that's bugged me this week because there's been more discussion about firms' pricing powers. There's two parts to it. There's like people don't take seriously that the firm can't do whatever they want because they're in competition. I'm not saying perfect competition or any sort of idealized, but like Walgreens needs to think about what CVS is doing and taking that relationship seriously. And then there's the broader equilibrium point, which is firms trying to do this will kind of fight against each other to the extent that, healthcare or pharmacies, the CVS, Walgreens, that industry is taking more of my money. I'm spending more money on that. That pushes against the fact that the lumber company is able to raise prices, or, Menards, Home Depot is able to raise prices. And people don't take that seriously and how those need to add up to 9% year over year inflation. Price levels being 12, 13% higher. I forget what the exact number is now relative to trend.
Yeah. And so can you explain to us like the corporate concentration argument and why it's not basically this monopoly power, or at least, as imperfect as it may be, or like basically the concentration is not the reason why we have inflation.
Yeah. So the connection to concentration is a little bit more subtle, and you can imagine ways in which it gets interesting, at least from a theory point of view, or someone who's really in the weeds of these models. So the idea is that if you have high corporate concentration, therefore firms don't have as much competitive pressure. That's one leap in the argument that I've spent a long time arguing that is not a good leap, but we can kind of ignore that for now. We have a measure. Markets are highly concentrated. That means there's not a lot of competitive pressure. Therefore, when they have, say, an oil shock, their input prices rise. Because they don't have that competitive pressure, they're able to pass through to consumers more of this oil shock. Prices rising on the cost side. So the basic idea is that, okay, yes, it's not that concentration changed overnight, or it's not that all of a sudden markets got more competitive, but over the last 30, 40 years, markets have gotten less competitive. Therefore, when the shock of COVID, when the shock of the war in Ukraine happened, like we were primed and ready for this terrible thing, this high level of inflation to happen. And that's a plausible argument. As I lay out in the paper, I think it has two faults. One is that the evidence that's brought to bear on it is just completely not compelling. We don't have the good data for that type of story yet. So it could be there. In 5 years, we'll have better data to tell whether that was true or not. And the second is the magnitude. Again, we need to talk about a 10% increase in prices, something on that order of magnitude. And the changes in concentration that we're talking about have not been, it's getting a little bit in the weeds here, but you would need to have a completely overhaul of the U.S. economy over the last 20, 30 years in a way that I don't think is compelling in the data either.
Yeah. Can you actually go back to the leap of faith?
Yeah.
Part, because I think it's really, really interesting, and it's also really relevant in the context of tech policy and the way a lot of people are talking about tech policy. This notion that because there's more concentration, it means there's less competition. Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah, so that's a thing that I've written, probably even more than inflation, a thing that I've written about all my complaints with this argument. So the basic idea the basic idea is that like the concentration, how many firms are in the market, that's an outcome. That's not something that necessarily kind of directly causes this. It's not like we just start, in grocery stores in New York City, there's this level of concentration. Grocery stores in Chicago have this level of concentration. We can kind of trace out what happens with those levels of concentration. Where do we see higher prices? Where do we see lower prices? The concentration level is itself some outcome of a competitive process that we need to take seriously. Things like fixed costs matter. Things like, how much profit you can make on a new big breakthrough invention matter to how many firms survive. Regulation matters as well too. Lots of different things. And so if we take seriously that how concentrated a market is, that's what economists call an endogenous variable. It's an outcome that we study. People have looked at, okay, when that changes, when concentration goes up or goes down because of some other factor, because tariffs are lower. When tariffs are lower, it's easier to bring imports. When it's easier to bring imports, there's more competition. Okay? When tariffs are lower, concentration goes up. The winners win more of the market. As technology improves, the winners win more of the market. But that's competition increasing generating a rise in concentration. And so we don't have this kind of neat mapping between concentration and competition. And that's the thing that's been well documented. I have a variety of newsletters I could point people to, but people look at international trade as when markets open up to more trade, which is like a clear example of, we all agree that that's more competition. Mm-hmm. We see concentration rise. So we shouldn't be starting from this point of view of concentration being a metric of competition.
Yeah, and it also seems that there's a lot of misunderstanding about along which margin firms compete. As it turns out, you can have two firms doing the same thing, the same thing exactly, or like take the tech company. They look as if they have this monopoly position in what they do, like serving, like just having Facebook user or whatever, but they compete on a ton of other margins. And so this notion that firms are never constantly competing, even with firms that are not in their industries, right? I mean, for one thing, they're always competing for labor, right?
I mean, it absolutely. The question is like quantitatively, how big of an impact does that make? And it depends on the question you're asking.
Yeah.
My instinct is exactly that. And I think that most people should learn more about that. Mm-hmm. I don't want to take it too far and act like, Facebook is competing.
No. I mean, but it's competing along some margins, even though there's only kind of one Facebook.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. And to circle back to prices and stuff like that, not everyone's going to be competing on prices and like a commodity. They're going to be competing on ease of consumer experience, ease of, credit and business to business transactions, like the nature of the contract. When are things paid? What sort of interest rate are you given if you're given a 60-day payment schedule? Like all these margins that you can compete on, and that's becoming the reason I'm thinking about that right now is that there's a lot of fixation within the antitrust community, which I write on those policy topics. There's people are recognizing all these different ways that competition plays out.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask you like your quick thought on what Lina Khan is doing on antitrust. I don't know if I could get a quick thought. I mean, I talked to Adam White, who wrote this piece at Commentary Magazine about the piece was named "The Power Broke Her," as I play on word, and it was. I mean, I thought it was really interesting because I didn't know very much about, but it seems that there's just a lot of debate right now around this notion about how you define competition. And you just had actually a blog post about this where you just look at the different types of competition. So I'm kind of curious about what you see.
I think it's fair to say, I don't think this is going to be uncontroversial, that I have a very different thought process and approach to antitrust than Chair Khan does, which means that there's a lot of disagreement on, especially the big cases, whether they're worthwhile to investigate or not, whether they're worthwhile to institute rules around non-competes. And so, I have not been her. We just see antitrust very differently. And circling back to competition versus concentration, I'll give one concrete example. So the DOJ, Department of Justice Antitrust Division, and the FTC jointly issue merger guidelines, which basically they have a few different roles, but one of them is to kind of give some guidance to companies and to potential merging parties of kind of what mergers they're going to challenge or what mergers are likely going to be challenged. It's not perfect, but it gives some guidance. They just, at the end of 2023, they issued new guidelines. Those doubled down on the role of concentration thresholds. Like if you are over this threshold of concentration, therefore the merger is, on the face of it, there's a structural presumption that this is anti-competitive. I get that those are a useful shortcut, but I think that I've written extensively that those are way overused in the current administration's approach, at least through the merger guidelines. The headline grabbing antitrust cases actually don't hinge too much on those concentration thresholds. Like, what is Facebook's concentration threshold? That's not really the reason that the FTC challenged Facebook from acquiring a VR company. But it's the structural presumptions. The concentration threshold is kind of one explicit area where Chair Khan and I disagree on how to think about competition.
And I can see that. One of the things that Adam White was saying in his article, and when he talked with me, is like it's wrong to just judge what she's doing or to judge her success based on how many lawsuits she wins, because ultimately, once you when you're a company thinking about a merger and you're in an environment where the FTC and the Department of Justice may actually going after you and making you incur enormous costs, legal costs, even if they lose, in the end, you may think twice about doing business. Is that something you're concerned about?
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's definitely, I mean, it's part of kind of any legal approach to blocking some activity, right? The judge of whether your murder laws are being well enforced and whatnot isn't the amount of people who get persecuted for murder or get convicted of murder, right? There's more to it, and so there's a deterrent effect, and I think that that's absolutely a part of and should be seen as a victory that should be seen as part of blocking mergers. The question is whether you're blocking good mergers or bad mergers, and that's harder to justify. If your goal is just to block more mergers, which Chair Khan is, I believe, I've never heard her say that exactly, but one could get the impression, and other people have said that. If your goal is just to block more mergers, then yes, that's successful. I don't think that should be the way that you assess an antitrust, either the committee or the antitrust division at the DOJ. Sorry, the commission. So to me, that's not. I'm not sure how big of a win that is. One of the things is this whole discussion with the FTC is it's kind of a moving target of what the goals are. For example, early on, the FTC lost against their challenge of Facebook or Meta acquiring a VR company called Within. Then people tried to spin that as actually a win because it opened up the possibility. The judge didn't reject their theory of harm. So therefore, the next time around, they could, maybe bring this new theory of harm. Like, okay, yeah. I think it's a good proxy of whether you're bringing good cases or not based on whether the court's going to accept them, and win-loss records matter.
But so you and I believe in the power of ideas. And I think kind of the biggest threat that I see with Lina Khan and her approach to deciding what is a competitive market and what isn't, and what is a market or a company move that requires government intervention, is precisely in the power of ideas. What I worry about is that while she may be losing in part because judges are still trained, are still old school kind of consumer welfare type of judges, that may not last forever. And in fact, what's happening is a lot of people coming out of law school, and are going to be really kind of influenced by these ideas. And then the next round, in however many years, right, are going to be some of these judges who actually are going to think that, it's that way of thinking about competition is the right way. That's kind of like my more long-term, because in the end, this is how kind of our side, broadly defined, kind of won the consumer welfare kind of battle, right? It's like at some point, antitrust judges just saw the world the way you see it.
Yeah. No, I think that is a concern, and that's something that we at ICLE actually spend a lot of time thinking about. We work with a lot of academics to try to improve, economics education, legal economics education, because of this concern. To think that, the way that economics came to be very important within law, especially within antitrust, it was a long battle of ideas. As much as I don't like thinking of ideas is a battle. Is a long engagement with ideas in economics, in legal academy, that then spilled over into how judges were trained, how the agencies were trained, and all that. And so absolutely, that's a long-term concern. It's something that I'm not the most optimistic about. I'm worried that more and more people are following in this neo-Brandeisian sort of way. At the same time, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves on that. It's still pretty far away.
So now I want to talk to you actually about your approach to policy. So you're an economist, and I think really your trademark, kind of like Casey Mulligan, I'll say, but I wanted to actually talk about the difference. It's like you use price theory. It's like really front of center of the way you think about things. So can you just remind people what price theory is?
Yeah, so I think that's right. I think that's a fair reading. Our newsletter, Josh Hendrickson and I's newsletter, is dedicated to price theory. Basically, we think of that as a way of doing economics, a way of thinking about economic problems. It doesn't neatly land in kind of micro macro sort of divisions. We're talking about inflation. That's a macro phenomenon. We were talking about antitrust. It's a micro study there. And both of those we think of can be studied with what we call price theory. So what is price theory in our lens? Our lens, it's a simple way, using simple models, supply and demand, slight variations of that with market power and things like that, but simple models, and trying to see how far we can stretch them in order to see what they say and try to constrain ourselves with making up new stories. Okay, why did prices rise? Well, let's think through what were the supply factors, what are the demand factors. And a central part of price theory is prices. And what matters are how prices are connected in the economy. That when I circle back to an earlier point we made, when the price of prices at CVS rise, that's going to affect the demand that consumers have for lumber. Those may not seem connected, and in a lot of applications, you're not going to think of them as being connected. But there are times that we should step back and think of how all these prices are connected. One area on which Josh and I are a little bit different than you brought up Casey. He's got behind me somewhere his textbook, Chicago Price Theory.
That was going to be my next question is what are the difference, if any, between the Chicago style price theory and the Brian style?
Yeah.
The economic forces.
Price style. Yeah. I think a few things. One is just my own quirkiness, that I'm more of a theorist than most price theorists are. It's kind of strange. It's called price theory, but actually someone like Casey's super empirical. He's an empirical applied economist. I'm a theorist by training. But that's a quirk about the way I do it. I'm interested in more theoretical questions. I think the bigger difference that we take from the UCLA style, from Armin Elchin, from Harold Demsetz, or people like that, is really a focus on property rights and the exchange of property rights, and how property rights affect, how prices and everything else carries out. Now, Casey obviously understands what property rights are. He understands the importance of it. Chicago people do. Milton Friedman has great pieces on the importance of thinking about property rights. Check out his review of Abba Lerner's book in the 40s. But really, if you look at kind of the bread and butter, like the famous papers from the UCLA school, there's a lot of things from the property rights economics. So why does that matter? Well, Elchin, Demsetz too, but Elchin and Demsetz, they really push this idea that what people are exchanging are bundles of property rights. Okay, when I sell you a house, I'm selling you certain property rights, things you can do with that house. For example, could you resell it? Could you live in it? Could you rent it out? Those things are affected by, those things aren't always the same. If I sell you a house that's in an HOA, you have a different bundle of property rights. If I sell you a rural house versus a city house, those have different bundles of property rights. And really disentangling kind of how those property rights work matter. And again, it's not that that's ignored in Chicago price theory, but that's like property rights economics comes out of UCLA, and that's kind of a core thing.
So how would you define the Chicago style?
So Chicago,
or is it just it's the same without the emphasis on
property rights?
Yeah,
I think that's right. I think there's more of an emphasis historically on perfectly competitive markets within the Chicago school. There's more of an emphasis on that sort of simplification of supply and demand sort of analysis.
And then the bundle of right kind of complicates that.
Kind of makes it harder to go forward. That's not perfectly true. In the Mulligan, the Mulligan, Murphy, Mirren, Jaffe Chicago price theory book, they have some sections that are a little bit, they don't explicitly say they're not competitive, but they're not competitive. They're about cooperation and how there's like money left on the table, and how do firms and customers haggle over that. So it's not a super clear distinction.
Yeah.
Josh and I wrote our newsletter for I think 3 years before we wrote a post called "What is Price Theory?" because we didn't really know what we were doing. Because we feel like we're doing something different than you see in most economics textbooks. We think it's a little bit different than you see in the Chicago price theory textbook, but I don't know. I wish I had a better understanding. Yeah. We have a post on it where we point to a few things, but the really subtle details about how does this differ from the Chicago school, I haven't been able to really pin that down.
And you actually have your latest post. It's called "It's Not Price Only Theory." So can you talk to us about this and why did you think that was such an important point to make?
This ties to our earlier conversation about the margins of competition. And the baseline economic model of supply and demand puts prices front and center. If the price is too high, there's going to be excess supply. The quantity of supply is going to be higher than the quantity demanded. Price will fall, so on and so forth. And prices are doing a ton of work. Everyone's responding to prices. The only thing that matters, the only thing that determines how people behave is prices. In real markets, that's not true. It's very important in some markets, but it's not the only thing. And so there are things like waiting time matters. Convenience at the store matters. And so firms can compete on those things. And so we've made that point a bunch of times. Why don't some industries prices move up and down very frequently? Stock market is obviously an extreme example. Uber and Lyft have tried to have really fast dynamic prices, trying to equate supply and demand in their markets. But things like restaurants have, they have a set menu for a while. When there's busy time because of whatever reason, there's a concert in town, they don't adjust their prices generally. They could sometimes try to do some things here and there, but generally they don't do that. And that's a part of the competitive process, is who's committing to a predictable price, who's committing to a predictable wait time. On Uber, Uber and Lyft, I have a more predictable wait time based on where I'm at. Like, that's kind of, price fluctuates a lot. Depending on where I'm at, usually the weight doesn't fluctuate that much. It still does. And so in that post, just stressing that there are lots of other margins, and firms are going to decide. Firms are trying to do more than just maximize their profits right now. They want to maintain customers. They want to build a brand that's known for X, Y, and Z, predictable behavior. People like that. And so firms are going to choose some strategy that kind of isn't just price wildly fluctuating like it's, the New York Stock Exchange.
And of course, like the price that has a lot of, that doesn't fluctuate as much as wages, for instance. There are a lot of instances where, like just wages aren't fluctuating as we would expect them to. And that's like, for instance, if there's a recession, like, it's easier to fire people, as tough as that is, than to actually tell people take lower pay, right? Yeah. Which so that's a good example.
So the paper that I use as a jumping off point was by Dennis Carlton, and it's all about it's taking this idea that firms are not changing prices super rapidly, and then wants to apply it and say, what does that matter for the way we think about recessions and unemployment and in this aspect? Absolutely. It also something that I hadn't really thought about, but your question just brought it to mind. It's intuitive of why people would want a predictable wage. Most people want a predictable wage relative to a predictable sandwich price. That you're going to be basing all of your budgeting off of this wage, more or less. Not everyone does. Some people have bonuses. Some people are on commission, but a lot of people want a more, if push comes to shove, more people want to have a fixed wage. They're not the residual claimant. They're not, making those profits because they can, they can do so much else of their life around that. And so it's not surprising that wages tend to be more fixed than other things.
Are there markets where wages fluctuate a lot? Like I was thinking, like if you're, let's say a day worker, would you kind of like one day you come and there's just a lot of people, so they lower the price, or do they even them have an interest to make sure that enough people show up every day, so they always have enough labor to keep prices higher?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, obviously Uber and Lyft have a very dynamic schedule. Any of the gig economy. Yeah. I don't know why I just did air quotes for a podcast, but I just did. Gig economy stuff is going to be fluctuating, a little bit more. I'm not sure of other spots. My intuition and what I understand from, knowing people in construction is that it doesn't fluctuate a lot because of, but then we can start thinking about, okay, why is it better to ration by people not getting the job than people getting a lower wage? And
in fact, did I remember correctly that the thing that started the reflection of that blog post is the daycare situation you were in, right? And you were like, you have to kind of be the first one to sign up to grab a spot. And you were thinking, well, this is a dumb system, right? I mean, prices would be used better. Then. So do you think actually,
but just to point out on that point, then I ultimately go by that, the economist's intuition isn't probably right. It isn't right as often as we think it is. There are reasons that not everything is auctioned off.
Yes. Yeah. There's it'd be an exhausting life. It would be. Now, I mean, with the time we have left, I want to talk about Armin Alchin. So your Substack is called Economic Forces. And I assume that this is from Alchin's book, Economic Forces at Work, right? So can you picked him, you didn't pick Dempsey, you didn't pick, Becker, who was also like a price theory guy. So can you tell us about Armin Alchin?
Yeah. So Armin Alchin is in my mind the greatest economist of the ever, I guess I'd say. He did not write a ton relative to kind of this legend that he is and the quality of his ideas. I forget who it was. Maybe Hayek said that he wouldn't win the Nobel Prize because he didn't write enough. And that was true. He didn't win the Nobel Prize. But he wrote on just everything. He wrote on inflation in the 70s. He was writing at like core, both theory and empirical on inflation. He wrote about property right economics that we talked about. Why do property rights arise? How do they evolve? Things like that. Founder of what became known as a property rights school of economics. He wrote on evolution and the idea that one of the things that happens in a market is that, it's not so much people's intentions. Do firms maximize profit? Well, it doesn't matter. Firms don't. What matters is that firms have to make positive profit to stay alive in the long run, and that competitive force matters. And that's something that Josh and I, yes, we write the Substack together, but we've also written academic papers together. We've written and taken on this like evolutionary idea that the competitive pressures matter for what happens in politics and markets and things like that. So Alchin wrote on a ton of stuff, which is what we wanted to write on. Dempsey didn't write on inflation. We didn't know we were going to write on inflation, but we knew we wanted to write on kind of everything when it came up. And so we did that. And it also just like general cool factor to Alchin. There's a story that Alchin, using publicly traded data, predicted what the next atomic bomb was going to be made out of just looking at publicly traded prices and which stocks rose on which announcements and stuff like that. So completely classified idea. He was able to back out from the prices. And that's just a cool, BA sort of thing.
I just got his textbook, which
the reprinting
from
Liberty Fund.
Reprinted from Liberty Fund.
There's a lot of cool stuff in there. It never really took off. It's called Universal Economics in the current edition. Never really took off because it's just a little too hard. It doesn't. I taught principles of micro and macro for 8 years, and I could never assign it as a textbook. It's just it's too deep. There's too many answers that could be, it depends. Whereas like for textbooks, you kind of need a right answer. It's tough to teach when there's not a right answer.
Yeah. Well, it's harder to grade.
That's right. Yeah. That's a good point. It's harder to grade. And as someone who has taught lectures with 500-600 people, it's not, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't, as much as I would love to do that in my, 10-person honors classroom, you just couldn't do it.
So let me ask you about the state of the economic profession. It seems to me that almost no one's doing economics in the way that was done by Altgen and their price theory colleague at UCLA anymore. Am I correct?
I think that's fair. Yeah. It's one of those.
No, this is why I was excited about you. There's still people, but in the academic world, it's just rare.
Yes. I think it's one of those things where it spills over and the impact is there. But yeah, the people who are like self-consciously doing price theory, there's not that much.
Yeah.
Like, we've literally mentioned basically the whole group. It's not quite true, but Casey Mulligan is like the main one in the actual profession still, producing research. Kevin Murphy, Josh and I try to do that. But even I'm not everything I do falls into that sort of category. There's other kind of pure theory stuff I do. I think it's part of this tying back to the textbook, the Elchin Allen textbook. It's just not everything leads to kind of as clean of results as you would like, as the modern profession would like. And there's a lot more open-ended kind of,
So are you worried about the state of the economic profession? I heard Stephen Levitt. Stephen Levitt was talking to
John Hartley.
Yeah, I was thinking, who was he listening to? And Levitt said that he thinks that economics is going to become like anthropology, basically like a field where only economists talk to economists, and that's about it. Which is kind of I thought, that's super. I mean, I have a lot of issues with the way economics is evolving, but with like the big data and all this trend, but like basically kind of like pretending that we could do away with theory in particular. But I was thinking, wow, this is kind of weird because I mean, when you look at like economists like Tyler Cowen, right? They're like, it seems that everyone wants to know what he thinks, for better or worse, on pretty much anything, like food. I mean, economists are hot. So I thought it was kind of interesting to hear him say that.
I would point out two things. One is, for whatever reason, the quality of the students that economics attracts is still very high in terms of just raw IQ, and that leads to job opportunities for them that are then that job opportunities for the students that they get associated with the field. It's still true that people place weight for just outside of academic stuff. There's still value to being an economics major. And so I think that's very sticky. It's very hard to, like, I would never want to start up a degree in price theory because it doesn't have all of those connotations of all the rigor that's in undergrad education. And to the extent you keep that rigor, even if it's maybe not ideal, even if it's, the intro courses are too much math, one benefit of that is that you attract good students and that's going to help you stay longer. I think that's going to be there for a while. Current students are, they're not maybe as in demand as, say, computer science or something like that, but it's still a relatively attractive major. And so that's going to do a lot. I think the second, thinking not just about the kind of undergrads, but thinking more of the true, research profession. I think that there's directions that I would like to see the profession go. I write a newsletter that explicitly is pointed towards students and practicing economists. Like, that is the audience. We don't write on the sexiest like policy topics. Sometimes there's some policy stuff that comes up, but like a lot of our posts are going into kind of old books and obscure theory points and stuff like that. And the only people who care about that are economists. And we want to influence how economists think about the world. And so we obviously, if we thought everything was going hunky-dory, we wouldn't worry about trying to do that. At the same time, there's been kind of a general move away from theory for quite a while. We're talking 30 years, and it's still, econ is still theory heavy relative to a lot of other fields, I think, in terms of, let's just say this, the theory is still there. It doesn't show up in all the papers. I wish it showed up in more, but there is a stickiness to this theory aspect. And there's a stickiness to the way we teach it. That theory is still heavy. Theory is still central. There's enough economists that think that that's true, even if not every, paper that looks at regression discontinuities or something shows a real heavy theory side.
Yeah. This kind of the theory or the kind of the less sex appeal of theory is what really concerns me. Because, for instance, like, as I said, like, you could say that some of it was present with modeling, but modeling, at least they had to kind of, ground some of their assumption into something, like into some theory. Whether that was done well or right. But what the big data movement worries me is because it seems to pretend to be actually want to like free yourself from theory. But the truth of the matter is, like, when you collect data, when you organize it, when you interpret it, effectively everyone has a theory, at least underneath, like, that is driving all of this. And what the person doing all of this while pretending that it's not bound by a theory is really effectively sneaking in a theory that they won't be accountable for. And that just kind of worries me. I prefer the kind of old school, like, there's a theory, let's do the empirical work and not like look at the empirical work and say, oh, it doesn't fit my theory, what's wrong with the world? But just say, okay, let's go back to the theory then. That process, is there hope for that process, you think?
I think so. I just don't think there's any other way for at least science and understanding as I know it to go. Maybe there's something deeper in, large language models and AI that changes this, but I'm not enough in the weeds to make that prediction. But just in the sense of, like, theory matters for exactly the reasons that you said. It's nice to have it out in the open more. It can never be completely out in the open. We know, there's always choices made of what questions to study and all these things that are going to have an impact, but it's good to have it out in the open. And one thing I'd point to is if you could do empirical work that is integrated with theory in some even tangential way, like, here's a little model, here I'm going to test it. Here's a little model, I'm going to fit data with it. I'm going to estimate it or something. That's huge reward in the profession still for that. Mm-hmm. There's not so much a reward for the type of theory that I did, which is kind of pure theory. And I think that's reasonable. And I understand that that's kind of gone down in prestige in the profession. That's fine. But I think the real issue is it's just really hard to do good quantitative work and tied with good theory. It's just like, I don't do it usually. Like, I have some empirical work. I have some theory work. I haven't done a great job of trying to tie them together. It's hard to do. That's why I don't think we should also look back and think that, oh, in the past people did it really well. I think there's a real selection bias there. The names that we've mentioned, the Gary Beckers of the world, were Gary Becker because he could do that, right? Yeah. Most papers in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 1970 were not that. Yeah.
So basically, you disagree with Stephen Levitt. Like, economics is not going the way of anthropology.
I forget exactly his reasoning on that, but I remember listening to it and thinking that he was overly negative about the way it was going to go. Absolutely.
I think that's a good way to end this podcast. Thank you so much for talking with me. That was fun.
That was a lot of fun. Thank you.